Is a third intifada on the way? Some are warning of a new Palestinian uprising as dozens are killed in Israeli airstrikes. And mob violence triggers talk of civil war. So, can this tension be contained? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. The word intifada is often used to describe mass Palestinian uprisings against Israel. Two such events have happened in the past, each lasting several years. Both were fueled by simmering anger at Israeli occupation and oppression. And right now, some see the beginnings of a third one. Israel is intensifying airstrikes on Gaza, killing dozens of Palestinians every day. The latest victims include children and their mothers in a refugee camp. Funerals often turn into mass demonstrations. Armed groups in Gaza, including Hamas, are retaliating by firing thousands of rockets into southern Israel. And in an unprecedented escalation, Jews and Palestinians living side by side are turning on each other in mixed cities across Israel. Mobs attacked homes, synagogues, and Muslim cemeteries. Israel's president is warning of civil war. On top of all this, Palestinians are marking Nakba Day to remember when tens of thousands of them were forcibly displaced as Israel was created back in 1948. Nida Ibrahim reports from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.
Many Palestinians have been telling us over the past days that they are protesting because they believe that the Nakba is still ongoing. It's not just an incident that happened 73 years ago, but that all of what happened, or most of what happened in 1948, is still ongoing now when it comes to Palestinians' lives under occupation. The land grabs, the expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, the settler attacks that are intensifying against Palestinians, the house evictions, so you name it. So for many Palestinians, this day not just remind them of what happened 73 years ago, but it reminds them that they are still living under these circumstances. This is why many protesters are taking to the streets of different cities in the occupied West Bank.
The two previous Palestinian uprisings took place in the late 1980s and early 2000s. The first intifada lasted 4 years and began in the Gaza Strip in December 1987. It was largely a series of spontaneous protests. About 2,000 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces, while more than 200 Israelis died. A second intifada started in occupied East Jerusalem in September 2000 and quickly spread to the occupied West Bank. Israel launched airstrikes and sent tanks into heavily populated Palestinian areas. Armed groups in Palestine launched attacks from occupied territories. About 5,000 Palestinians were killed over 4 years. All right, for more on all this, I'm joined by our guests in Yafa, Sally Abed, member of the National Leadership Standing Together, a Jewish-Arab social movement. In London, Yossi Mekelberg, Associate Fellow of Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. And in Dublin, Yaser Alashqar, Assistant Professor at Trinity College, Dublin, and academic member of the Centre for Palestine Studies at University of London, SOAS. A warm welcome to you all. Sally, let me start with you today. From your perspective, is what we're seeing here the beginnings of a third intifada?
I don't think you're going to get an answer from me, a yes or no answer. I'm going to tell you what feels different this time.
All right, what feels different this time?
This time, I think we have accumulation of many, many things that are happening. In the past few years, we are seeing a tremendous development in the settler movement in Israel. They are settling in mixed cities, such as Akka, such as Lod, Yafa, Eastern Jerusalem, Eastern Jerusalem is really a very, very special case, but really, they are going into Israel, not occupied territories according to international law, and they are actually settling there and creating many provocations. These things are happening, and they are, escalating from time to time. And in recent months, it really has escalated both in Jaffa, in Lod, and in Ramle. That's one thing that's happening. The second thing is happening is the nation-state law. The nation-state law, or what Israelis call the nation-state law, has really shifted the conversation for Palestinians in Israel. It really has shifted the narrative of the people, or weakened the narrative that many Jewish Israeli politicians and leaders have tried to create, which is, the narrative of the Arab Israelis, or the fact that we are a democratic country where we enjoy full rights, and there is no contradiction between a Zionist and a democratic state, and that the nation-state law really made that very deep break in that narrative, which many Palestinians in Israel has really grasped on. It has to do with many things that we can go on, but we should, you could ask me about that later, of why many Palestinians really.
Sure.
But let's not go into that. A third thing is the fact that we are seeing that there are very, very violent extremists who are affiliated with violent organizations that has been elected to the Israeli Knesset, and who are seen as legitimate, representatives of the Israeli public. These people are, such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are, these attacks, the Jewish attacks that are happening. You said it's intercommunity violence. It's absolutely not intercommunity violence. What we're seeing is outside organized attacks of Jewish militants, settler militants, who are coming and actually attacking Palestinian homes. They are signing them. They're actually marking Palestinian homes. And going and having organized attacks on houses with the help of the police. In many cases, it's actually, I know it sounds like it's not real, but there are many cases where the police has actually invaded houses in Haifa, and 2 days ago, and settlers came in after the police, and they actually vandalized the place while the police was there in the private home of Palestinians in Haifa. So that's another thing. The Arab-Palestinian violence, on the other hand, is very similar to what we've seen in 2000, in October 2000, at least within Israel. We are seeing a lot of arson. We are seeing a lot of burning. Palestinians are burning their own cars and their own trash cans. It really is, and obviously there is Palestinian citizens of Israel who are attacking Jewish citizens. That also is happening. However, it's really a very different type of violence. So I wouldn't call it intercommunity violence.
Sally,
so these are the different.
Sure. Sorry, let me stop you there, because I do want to get back to that point in a few moments, but I want to go to Yossi now. Yossi, you heard Sally there talk about what's different this time. From your vantage point, how does what is happening now compare to the first and second intifadas?
I think in terms of what's happening inside Israel, it's probably one of the worst that I can recall, if not the worst situation of fights between Jews and Arabs. Because the first intifada and the second intifada were mainly between Israelis, the Israeli military and security forces, and Palestinians in the occupied territories. This changed. This is inside Israel proper. And I think this probably should worry all Israeli leaders if it's not actually deteriorating into a civil war. I think this should be a wake-up call when you see lynching, when a Palestinian cemetery is attacked, when a synagogue is set on fire, when there is lynching in the street. I don't think we've seen in the past, and this should worry everyone. And I think Sally is absolutely correct. There were changes in the society that hasn't been addressed. There is a common neglect of the Arab society in Israel, and the nation-state law was definitely a watershed in the feeling among the Israelis, Arabs, that they are Palestinians, in the way they feel inside Israel. Because if the state, as the law says, is the same of the Jewish people, and everything that the Jews do is superior to the minority that lives there, they're supposed to be equal citizens but are not. So what's space left for them to prosper, to become part of the society? And this is one of the things that I think this serves as a wake-up call to both. That's what happens if such a situation evolves. This is the end result of it. And one more thing about it, the police let extreme elements in both sides to prosper, and especially the rise of the far right in Israel. This is what that's the end result of it, that they find themselves empowered to go and provoke Palestinians within Israel, and by the way, also in the occupied territory.
Yaser, the grievances that fueled both the first and second intifadas, those grievances are still very much present today, are they not?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. Let's remember those grievances are not new. The story of Palestine is not new. The story of the Palestinians is not new altogether. The Palestinians have been under attack by Zionism since the First World War, and before that, the Palestinians also have been engaged in a national struggle since the Balfour Declaration. And this is the time when Britain agreed that Palestine would be transformed into a national home for Jewish people, which later became the State of Israel. And Palestinians have been engaged in this national struggle since 1948 against Israeli occupation and colonial practices. And we can see now that today the four Palestinian national groups are imploding, and there is an implosion in the region. That's what I see, and that's what I understand. The four Palestinian groups that I'm talking about, or national groups and communities, are the first one is in the Gaza Strip. And in the Gaza Strip, this group of people has been subjected to a very severe blockade since 2007, which has deprived them of their basic human rights. And this blockade has been controlled by Israel, by land, by sea, and by air. If you look at the second national group, which is in the West Bank, in the West Bank, it's been the West Bank is under Israeli full occupation and under the control of Israeli settlements. And the Israeli settlements in the West Bank represent 65% of the total amount of land in the West Bank. So 65% of the West Bank territory is under Israeli direct military control and the control of the Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law. Now, Palestinians in the West Bank continue to face discrimination, continue to face Israeli checkpoints, and also the realities of the wall. The wall and the occupation have taken over Palestinian resources in the West Bank, including agricultural resources, natural resources. And this has been a difficult challenge for Palestinians. We also have to remember that in the West Bank, there are more than 500 Israeli checkpoints, which cut Palestinians from each other, not Israelis from Palestinians, but really cutting off Palestinians from Palestinians. And that is difficult. If we move to the third group, which is the third Palestinian national group, which is in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, Palestinians have been facing a systematic policy since 1967 and the occupation of East Jerusalem. They have been facing a systematic policy of home evictions and demolitions and discrimination, including residency rights. Their rights are not recognized, their national and political rights in their city, in Jerusalem, and in their land. Their rights are not recognized. House demolitions have been continuing since 1967. It's a systematic Israeli policy that is supported by the Israeli government.
I'm sorry. I am sorry to interrupt you. It's just that we're starting to run out of time, and I do want to get back to you about that point in just a couple of moments. Sally, I want to go to you about something else that a lot of people are saying is a bit different this time, and that's the role of, or the type, rather, of activism that we're seeing among the younger generation of Palestinian protesters. From your point of view, how different is it? I ask that because at the moment, we are seeing so many defiant young demonstrators. They're constantly posting videos on social media platforms. They're posting infographics to try to break down what's at the root of all of this. And it seems to be breaking through to many people around the world in a way that it didn't in the past. What do you think about that, and how different is it from years past?
Absolutely. I think that the ability of Palestinians to actually document their experiences as Palestinians and actually creatively, amazingly, reporting it to the world has really affected, among other things, among many other factors, but has affected the global narrative and the global solidarity, and has really weakened, the narrative of how legitimate is all the tactics of the Israeli government to actually maintain the occupation and the siege on Gaza, and what's happening inside of Israel as well. And I'll tell you another thing. Within Israel, I think Palestinian youth has more than ever been active and not afraid, in a sense that, I remember my grandma is a Palestinian who experienced the Nakba, all of my grandparents, the four of them. And I don't recall ever them actually talking about the narrative in a way that is politicized, in a way that is, let's go and resist. And that's the experience. Obviously, there was resistance within Israel, of Palestinians within Israel, always. There has always been. But there was also, a sense of fear, a sense of wanting to just assimilate and belong. And they started learning the language. My parents' generation, they actually started going to universities and started getting jobs that are in offices with Jewish colleagues, and they actually started being fluent in Hebrew. So they were even more assimilated within the Israeli society and assimilated into the narrative of Arab Israelis, and distancing themselves from the Palestinian narrative. Our generation is very different. We are actually more educated than ever. We are more assimilated than ever. We speak fluent Hebrew. We live in Tel Aviv, and we live in Haifa, and we live in all the places that are very mixed. And we are, there is more sense of equality in many areas, such as in the space when you speak the language fluently and when you're educated. Obviously, there's still systematic discrimination, but we feel more confident to actually identify as Palestinian, actually identify, express our anger and express our desires of freedom and of resistance. And that has affected Israeli left. The Israeli left has been a very Zionist, traditional liberal left that has been standing in solidarity with Palestinians in the West Bank, in Gaza, without actually acknowledging the Palestinian narrative of the Arab public, the Arab society in Israel, and that has been changing.
Yossi, let me ask you this. There are many actors on the world stage right now that are calling for de-escalation. They are calling for a cessation of hostilities or a ceasefire. And let me ask you first, is there a possibility that we could see a ceasefire? Because we're not hearing a lot of de-escalatory language from, the Israelis or the Palestinians at the moment. But the other thing I want to ask you is, even if there is some kind of ceasefire or cessation of violence, how does that impact the violence that we've seen playing out in these mixed communities? It's much harder to contain that going forward, is it not?
Absolutely. I think it's important, though obviously there are obvious links between what happened in Gaza, in the West Bank, and inside Israel. And we should mention also 5.5 million Palestinians that are refugees in different parts of the Middle East. There are linkages. At the same time, each of these issues have its own unique aspects that we need to address, and some of them actually Sally mentioned. So a ceasefire will take place. It might take another day or 2 days, or sometime maybe next week. Depends what's the dynamic of the war with Hamas in Gaza. But there will be a decision. What happens within Israel, it actually should worry all Israelis that live within the Green Line. Whatever the impact of what happened in Gaza and the West Bank, these are things that some of these strong feelings, the resentment, the malaise among many Arab Israelis is authentic. It's part of what happens in Israel, not necessarily what happened in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, or in Gaza. It goes to the continuous discrimination of 20% of the population. And again, the divide is not necessarily right now between Jews and Arabs. It's between those who believe that can be a coexistence, reconciliation, that the two people can live in peace in the same land, respecting each other, and each citizen have exactly the same rights, and those who don't think like this. And if it needs a national dialogue, it needs legislation to change. It needs to respect the rights and the needs of each community, because it's not Israel is a mosaic of different people and different communities. President of Israel, President Rivlin, called it once the tribes. And these tribes need to learn how to talk to each other and how to live and coexist with one another without harboring and one creating this kind of strong resentment. And what we see in the street is not just resentment, it's deep hatred to one another. And that's really should worry everyone.
Yaser, you were talking about the violence earlier. Let me ask you this. Is there any chance we will see a de-escalation in the violence in the near term? And secondly, is there any international actor who could play an effective mediation role right now?
Well, I was talking about the root causes, to be honest with you, rather than the violence, the root causes of where this violence comes from. And I'm clear on that. The four Palestinian national groups in Israel, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza have been facing a systematic policy of discrimination, of apartheid, of occupation, of lack of national rights. And this needs to be addressed in order for us to move forward. I mean, Beit Salem, the Israeli organization, human rights organization, Rabbis for Human Rights, and also Human Rights Watch at the international level have all said that the Palestinian situation in the occupied territories and within Israel is getting worse, and Palestinians are facing apartheid. So we need to deal with that. We need to recognize this apartheid reality in order to move forward. And that's what I've been talking about. Now, the second point, moving on, is about the long-term solutions, which your point is related to. I believe in terms of conflict resolution, we need a change of policy on the side of the US. We need also a change of policy on the side of the EU. If you look at the EU is the largest economic donor to the Palestinians. The EU also has trade relations and economic relations with Israel, but at the same time, the EU hasn't been playing any political or effective political role. And the reason is it's the US pressure. It's under pressure from the US not to intervene. And secondly, it's also divided about Israel, and it's divided about what happened to Jewish people in Europe in the past. So there is still that sense of historical guilt. Now, moving on to the US has always presented itself as a mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. But the record actually and the policy, when you look at it, it tells you something different. And I've looked at this policy and I've looked at this record. It tells you that the US isn't a credible mediator, isn't an honest mediator. The US is a strategic ally of the state of Israel, and Israel is a major ally also of the US. Israel continues to serve the interests of the US in the region. So, and the US continues to provide weapons and financial aid and diplomatic as well support to Israel at the international level. You can also look at what happened at the UN Security Council in the last 2 days. It hasn't been able to meet and discuss the situation in Israel, Palestine, or in Gaza. Why is that? Because of the US pressure. It doesn't want to put pressure on Israel to stop. So what we need is, in order for mediation to succeed, we need to acknowledge the root causes, and we need also to have credible international players who are ready to deal with the root causes.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Sally Abed, Yossi Mekelberg, and Yaser Alashqar. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.